What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota, Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, brother? How are you?
Chilling, man. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. I just got back from Washington, D.C.
Oh, did you? Did you participate in the women's marches there? Or?
I did not know there were women's marches there.
You learn something new every day.
Yeah, I didn't see them. They were nowhere close to me, and I was all over that city. As much as we talk shit about D.C., I actually do like the city. It is very nice. They have a nice little restaurant scene. Yeah. They have a nice brunch scene. They have a pretty good museum scene. Not like that. Not like I go to museums.
I love museums, and they're all free.
I do like everything's free there.
Yeah,
everything's free. And I actually came to an epiphany. Well, more like a conclusion. So I was in the Washington D.C. Zoo, and it's a pretty nice zoo. It's a better zoo than any zoo that I've been in New York. And,
really? Better than the Bronx Zoo?
I've actually never been to the Bronx Zoo.
You have to go to the Bronx Zoo. That shit is massive.
I'm using like the shittiest museum,
the one in
shittiest
Central
zoos
Park.
as the benchmark right here. But and I'm talking about petting zoos I've been to. So I'm in there and I'm like, wow, this is an awesome zoo. And there's lions, there's tigers, there's giraffes, there's elephants, there's red pandas, just a huge collection of lizards and crazy lemur-type monkeys. They had orangutans, gorillas, they had chimps. They really had a pretty wide collection of animals. And there's people running through that zoo. And mind you, it's about 30 degrees out. It was a cold weekend. Mm-hmm. And I find when I leave the museum and I'm like, I'm paying for this shit. My tax dollars go to this fucking museum so some runner can run run with the lions or run past the tigers. And I became extremely resentful. I was like, fuck this zoo. No, it was actually a pretty awesome zoo. So I did enjoy my time there. I couldn't find Comet Pizza.
Oh, well, you want to pay a visit to the globalists?
I was going on a rescue mission. Could not find it. But let's get started because we have a lot to cover today.
Yeah, we do.
We have a shitload to cover.
And actually, this topic was originally introduced last episode, but we had to cut it out because we ended up talking way too much. So it was something that had just broke that day last week that I was super interested in, but it was the right move because we needed to take some time and really like dig into the subject and find some information so we can share with you.
You were on editing duty last time, and I'm not sure what you left in the podcast, if you left anything, but we were talking about this probably for about maybe 15, 20 minutes, and I think we cut it out just because it warranted its own episode, and we had more to say than the time that was left on the podcast. So we're going to be talking about Russia, we're going to be talking about Putin, and we're going to be talking about the 2020 Russian constitutional referendum. I guess you explained what happened and why this is important.
Right. So last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin dropped a pretty big bombshell of news. And the news was that he was introducing 11 new proposals to amend the Russian constitution. And it's a pretty big deal because a lot of these changes, not to spoil any of them, but they have a lot to do with the way that Russia's government power structure is organized, and it we're here in the United States, and a lot of the mainstream media will obviously paint Russia and Putin broadly as our adversary, and everything they do has to be bad. But I found myself, sitting back and thinking about some of these referendums, and I was like, whoa, I kind of agree with a lot of these. So it was interesting in and of itself because of what he's proposing. But even more interesting was that in order to achieve this, he basically asked his entire government, like all of his appointed cabinet ministers, to resign. So they've all either resigned already or are preparing to resign.
Yeah, and they left willingly. And it's
Yep.
kind of funny how. So when this first happened, and when the news broke out, and they were talking about these constitutional reforms, the way that the media portrayed it was almost laughable. So the headlines, at the very least, were comparing it to Xi Jinping, and I was like, "What? Are we looking at the same story? Are we looking at this?" But of course, like the media is just kind of crazy when it comes to Russia. Like listen, I'm not a Putin apologist. I'm not a Putin apologist.
I'm not a
man.
blank apologist.
I don't like Putin. I think there's a lot of bad things that he's done over the years, and there's definitely a lot of blood on his hands.
Yeah,
but
and we'll definitely talk about it too.
I think you need to condemn the behavior and not the person, and not just have an automatic response to whatever somebody does, and look at things on a case by case basis, no matter who it is.
Yep, I totally agree with that.
So. Let's just go through this, because the way the media has portrayed this is the way the globalist media has portrayed this. The way the media has portrayed this is that it's like a power grab, or it's a way for Putin to find a way to take power or to obtain power through the shadows, and it's really just being kind of spun as, I'll just say it frank, it's kind of anti-Russian propaganda. However, some conclusions from the mainstream media are I kind of felt myself agreeing with, but let's go through this and I don't know. Let's try to be objective over this. I mean, we're not objective. I know people like us because they think we're objective, but we're not objective. We both have our biases.
But we check each other.
But
though,
yeah,
right?
we check each other. But let's go through this and let's just go over the 2020 Russian constitutional referendum.
All right.
And by the way, one complaint I had is that I couldn't find these anywhere. I had to I got to put these together. Not a single source that I read was actually sourcing this and listing these out, which I thought was just like,
such a pain in the ass.
If you're right for CNN, how do you not go through every single bullet point and maybe put your spin on it at the very least, but put every bullet point out there? There was no one who was doing this. No one did this. I had to go through fucking a Russian magazine and have it translated. So let's go over one.
Honestly, to harp on that point, though, dude, I think that's kind of the reason why I was so skeptical about it, because when I learned about it, it was through like a video news source where they explained a few, like in the video, a few of the proposals, but then of course did their Russian propaganda thing, anti-Russian propaganda, that is. And, it really, it shocked me in a kind of way, because immediately I'm like, you read the headline, it says Putin proposes, constitutional changes. And I'm like, oh shit, here we go. Like, that was my first reaction. Like, this dude is going to declare himself king of Russia or some shit like that, and when you dig into it, a lot of this is just like, that's not even the case. It's actually quite the opposite,
All right, so let's go over this. This isn't the order that they were proposed. However, it's just the order that I wrote them down. So we're going to go through most of the points that are important. So 1, the State Duma, the lower house of parliament, should have the right to approve the prime minister's candidacy. Currently, it only gives consent to his appointment. The State Duma will also be able to approve the candidates of deputy prime ministers and federal ministers. The president will not be able to refuse their appointment, but in some cases will be able to remove them from office.
All right, so let's say that in English now.
So essentially what this means is that they're shifting the power to appoint the prime minister from the executive office, from the president, to the Duma, which is the Russian parliament.
Right. And for those who are unaware, Russia's got like a system that's kind of like ours, but also kind of like a British parliamentary style, right? So they have a president, but they also have a prime minister, and they also have a lower house parliament. That's the State Duma, right? But once the president, at least currently, is elected, that president basically has pretty broad scope to formulate the government in the way that he chooses, right? So in this case, currently today, if Vladimir Putin wanted to, was just elected, he appointed Medvedev, or however you pronounce his name, as the prime minister, and this was, they under the consent of the Duma, but not under the approval. And that's really important because it's just like they can give him a thumbs up, but like honestly, if he said that that's the guy he wants, there's not a whole lot that they could have done against it. And in this case, it formalizes that right of the lower house. This is like the House of Representatives here. Imagine the House of Representatives here. They're the ones who approve the prime minister, the president's pick for prime minister, right? They have to approve it, and that's the way that it would go from now on. And that's pretty big, right? That's literally stripping a piece of, that presidential power away from future presidents in Russia.
Yeah, and what you can argue right here, and I'm not really playing devil's advocate because there's actually some truth to this, but I think a lot of what we're going to be seeing here, to give the mainstream media some credit, is that I think Putin is kind of closing the loopholes that let him gain power. And I think that you're going to see a continued theme of this. So Number 2 is remove the in a row clause from the article regulating the maximum number of presidential terms. So essentially what this is doing is that this is limiting the president to 2 consecutive terms. So by removing in a row, now the president of Russia can only go on 2 consecutive terms. And this is how Putin actually came back to office. So he served 2 terms from 2000 to 2008.
Right.
And then his buddy, Dmitry Medvedev, I'm suck at pronouncing Russian names, so I apologize, served 1 term from 2008 to 2012 while Putin ran for prime minister. But afterwards, Putin ran for president again in 2012, and he's been president ever since. He's right now, he was recently elected, and he's going to be president until 2024.
Right. And this to be clear, they serve 6-year terms, right? Yeah. So, they having 2 consecutive terms here would be like 3 presidential terms in the United States.
Yeah, and what he's essentially doing right here is that this is a loophole. So Putin is closing that loophole so no one else can do the same thing that he did.
Right, and what's also important to note is that Putin is currently the longest serving leader of Russia since fucking Stalin or Lenin. I forget which one comes last. And he's overtaken them. Now it hasn't been consecutive technically because he did have that stint in the middle when Medvedev, the current prime minister, was president and he was prime minister. But, you could argue that Putin was in power the whole time.
Yeah, he was definitely in power. Dmitry Medvedev is kind of it's kind of like a Putin crony, kind of a Putin shill type guy who does whatever he says, is his long standing, buddy or sidekick type guy. But I mean, this goes without, let's just be real right here. This is a sneaky power grab that Putin was using, and he's basically trying to eliminate this for anyone else to use in the future. Now, it would be like
if Barack Obama, Joe Biden got the nomination and Barack Obama was the vice president, It'd be
or something
pretty
like
similar.
Or something like at the end of FDR's presidency, then he finally made it, he introduced a bill or he pushed for a bill to limit the presidential the president's to 2 terms because FDR served 4 terms as president.
Right.
So it's kind of like that, but I mean, you could say you can take 2 approaches. This is for one, maybe this is for Russian nationalistic reasons, for the greater good, because he doesn't want somebody who is not him taking power and someone who does not see fit to take power in Russia running away and doing the same things that he did.
I'm sure that's part
specifically, of it. Specifically, a lot of the the liberal class of Russia who is, and we're going to get deeper into this, but a lot of the liberal kind of critics of Putin or nationalist or even radical nationalist critics of Putin taking power and using these types of loopholes, I think he's trying to oversee, this theme is that he's trying to oversee, who his successor is and kind of trying to nip and limit their power. But let's go into the next one because this one is interesting as well.
Yeah.
So the Russian Constitution should take precedence over international law.
This one was a bit triggering for me. I don't know. How about what did you think?
So here's my take on this. Now, obviously, we want it when people are in a perfect world, in a perfect geopolitical landscape where everyone was living in peace and there were no atrocities or war crimes and there was no invasions of sovereign nations and things like that, and there was no genocides taking place. International law would be a great thing to follow. However, here's the thing. Now, this is to Russia's credit. To Russia, or no, I'm not going to say Russia's credit, but to Russia's point of view.
Right.
Why are they going to follow international law when basically not a single other country on earth follows international law?
Us especially.
The United States does not follow international law. The British do not follow international law. The Israelis definitely do not follow international law. The Saudis definitely do not follow international law. Like nobody's
playing by the rules.
Nobody is playing by the rules. Nobody's playing by the rules at all. And they're trying to kind of cover their grounds as far as, maybe legal disputes and things like that. Mm-hmm. So they can't be crucified by the standards of international law when they see other countries like the United States and Britain and not playing by those rules. So I think that's why they're taking a Russian constitution over international law.
I mean, I hear that. I totally understand why this proposal is on the table for those reasons exactly. Like, the argument there being that, the rest of the world are just hypocrites. They don't follow it either. Why the hell should we? We're just playing it straight and saying like, hey, we're going to, Russian law is more important to us than international law. And I get it, right? It's a very honest approach. But at the same time, there is kind of a almost like a moral obligation, in my opinion, to place that international law to the forefront, because what this is saying is, at least in my opinion, on my read, is that Russia is saying we are going to break the law, like we intend to break it, and therefore we have to have this clause in our constitution that says that our constitution takes precedence over the international law. If they were saying something to the tune of, we are adopting international law into the Russian constitution, then they would be saying, we agree with, these laws that are internationally held, and we don't have any, intention of breaking any of these laws. And so I think what it does is this might be super benign now, but it sets the stage and it sets a precedent, frankly, for Russia to say, we do whatever the fuck we want, because it's in our constitution, and to hell with international law, because international law isn't in our constitution. And there's a reason why we have international law. Like, we have agreed upon standards that admittedly lots of countries don't actually follow. But at the very least, it's not like when we say the United States doesn't follow international law, we're not saying that they follow exactly zero international laws. We're saying that they take certain liberties of ignoring particular international laws. And I think, in my opinion, I think it's better to say we observe international law and break them sometimes, rather than say we observe the Russian Constitution and maybe we'll observe international law, like when it suits us. So that's where I was like super weird about that.
Well, that's kind of the language. Just should take precedent over international law just means that we're playing by our rules first, not international standards. Because I think it's just because they see other countries doing it. But I mean that's a fair point. I think countries should live by standards of not invading each other, but it's like no one's enforcing this stuff anyway. So it's like, what the fuck?
Yeah, it's just like a matter of approach that I just don't love.
The only person that enforces this stuff is the United States, and they enforce it illegally. They're like, oh, international law, Iraq. All right, so 4, a presidential candidate must live in Russia for at least 25 years. It's currently 10 years. So what they're doing is that they're making the standards for... So essentially what they're doing right there is they're making it hard for people who have left the country, either, on their own will or been exiled out of the country, making it harder for them to come back in and take power. So within Russia, there's a lot of enemies of Putin that have been exiled who are living in Britain. For example, I think this is just a way to make it harder for those certain enemies of Putin to come back in and I don't know, gain any type of influence.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of like the mainstream narrative as well. Like, that's what I'm hearing about this particular point. But, you know, there's also the other. So, like, when I first read it, I'm like, on the face of it, it doesn't sound that bad. You know, I think it's reasonable of any country to expect that their country's leader have lived in their own country for some long period of time. 10 years it was what it was currently. I guess boosting that up a bit, you know, makes sense geopolitically for certain reasons. But yeah, you're right. It's hard to ignore the fact that Putin and Putin's administration has pretty much pushed a lot of dissidents out of the country if they survived at all. We'll talk more about people who died that were dissidents or contrary to his administration. But one person that kind of sticks out in my mind, or actually, we'll save that for one of the next ones. We'll save it for the next ones.
Yeah, and let's put a pin in that because we're going to talk about that after we go through this. A lot of the people who've been exiled out of the country. So the minimum wage cannot be lower than the subsistence minimum. Okay, that's just a welfare thing. That's not anything.
Suddenly I get Andrew Yang vibes from this. Apparently they were talking about doing universal basic income in that as well. I'm like including that in their constitution. And then in that case, I was just like, holy shit. Since when did Putin become more liberal than like Bernie Sanders or like Andrew Yang?
They have Social Security and they do have welfare programs in Russia as well. It's not just the United States who issues that stuff out. Pretty much every Western country is giving out some type of handout to people. And basically what this is that it's just protecting, I guess, certain benefits against inflation and stuff like that. So,
right,
or living standards and that. So if there's inflation, then the benefits they dish out will go up with the collapse of Russian currency.
And I think that's actually the right move. Obviously, the question arises for more conservative folks, fiscally conservative folks, like how the fuck are you going to pay for it? And, you know, Russia's economy is kind of, touch and go at this point. But a big reason that I was reading about for this one was that, you know, their birth rates are super low right now in Russia, which, you know, for those who aren't like studious in economics, low birth rates are bad for the economy because there are fewer people being born and, you know, fewer people paying into the welfare systems to support the retirees. And in this case, by offering kind of this bottom floor to the folks that are, you know, that are probably at or below the poverty line, it ensures that they have the ability to have children. And all over the world, birth rates are declining in general. A big part of it is because of income inequality. I'm not trying to be liberal and preachy here. It's just a fact, right? And, you know, when people don't have very much money, you know, at least the trend is going this way. They choose to have less children, which is it's a smart fiscally conservative thing to do, right? If you can't afford a kid, don't have one. But, you know, that would be bad for the future of any country if they have a low birth rate because of a low, you know, a poor economy. It turns into like a negative feedback loop there. And so I think he's trying to address that directly by saying, look, we'll take care of you at the subsistence minimum, and we'll make sure that your minimum wage can't be lower than that, so that even if you're working at Starbucks in St. Petersburg, you know, you're not gonna starve, and that will promote higher birth rates in the country. I think that's what they're going for there. I actually kind of agree with it.
That actually is what they're going for. I think you've nailed exactly what they are going for. Before they introduced this, that was actually the theme of his. It was like during a Russian version of the State of the Union address,
right?
And he was basically kind of talking about one of the biggest threats in Russia right now is the declining birth rate. I personally don't endorse this type of economic policy. However, I mean, I think you kind of laid out the reasoning of why they would want to do it pretty well. So, all right.
Number 6.
I wrote these down all stupid. I wrote them down twice in no particular order, and I wrote down the same ones twice. Okay. So, all right. Persons who hold important positions for ensuring the country's security, so presidents, ministers, judges, heads of regions, should not have foreign citizenship or residence permit in other countries, either at the time of their work in office or at any time before. So what they're doing is that they're banning dual citizenship in high government offices, which I think America should probably do.
Yeah, we should.
No dual loyalties. So basically, it's restricting people who've ever had dual citizenship ever. So if you've ever had dual citizenship in any part of your life, you're not able to run for president of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm on the fence about this one, and this one was also a bit triggering for me too. So on the one hand, as you point out, I kind of agree. Like someone who is, in the highest security clearances of a particular country. In this case, they point out specifically presidents, ministers, judges, heads of regions. Yeah, you shouldn't hold a dual citizenship. Like there should be no dual loyalty there, right? You shouldn't have any outside influence because you should be, you as a state representative, you are working for the interests of the people of that state, right? Of that country. So in that respect, I totally agree. And in that way, I was just like, oh, Putin's got a good idea here. We should think about that. But at the same time, the kind of subtext, the fine print of this one says that it restricts people who have ever had a dual citizenship from running. Now, I'd be on board with this 100% if they said you have to renounce your dual citizenship and declare one citizenship. That makes sense to me, right? Because that's even taking a step to saying like, hey, I had a dual citizenship. I'm now 100% Russia, right? And that's why I'm running for president, right? Like I'd get that. That would make total sense to me. But restricting, people who have ever had a dual citizenship, this, I think, effectively sometimes precludes, Russian children of dual national parents, right? So, for example, if you had a Russian citizen who, was born in Russia, grew up in Russia, but, one of their two parents was an American, technically, that would make that person American, right? Under American law, you're, what is it? The right of, help me out here, Henry. What is that called? The shit that Ted Cruz used to try to run for president, even though he's a Canadian, Cuban, whatever. I forget the actual word for this, but there's a right, like a birthright citizenship. There we go. That's the word. Birthright citizenship that says if you are the child of an American citizen, you're born abroad, you are a American citizen. And so any of those people would have dual citizenships. Now, obviously, I think specifically they're trying to prevent, Americans from, colluding and meddling in Russian affairs, which is funny and ironic in many ways. But that specific line that says it would prevent you from running for these offices if you have ever had a dual citizenship, I think is fairly targeted at folks who might not fall on the same political spectrum as Putin.
I think it's targeting a lot of the British, the exiles in Britain, and probably their kids too.
Yep.
To be completely honest, so I don't. It's the point. I know a lot of people who have parents who are immigrants, and either or this, they were born in a different country. So my cousin was born in Germany. He's German citizenship, but he spent about, I don't know, maybe about 2 months in his life in Germany. He was an infant when he was born in Germany, and he moved to the United States, and that was because his father was in the military. So I mean, there's a lot of military families across the country. I'm just talking about in the context of the U.S. There's a lot of military families across the country who are born in different countries, who are born outside of America, and they have citizenship of the country that they're born in, and they come back. So in cases like that, it's a little different. And of course, there's also kids who, maybe their parents are internet or let's say they're British. They could be born in a hospital in Britain, but spend most of their adult life in the United States, or all of their adult life and their child life in the United States. So there's that. But of course, this is kind of aimed at people with dual loyalty, and of course, what in the American context, the people that pop out, and I think in most people's minds, are the neoconservative types who had dual citizenship to Israel, like Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz, and pretty much that whole kind of neoconservative cabal that was in the Office of Special Plans and kind of laid out a lot of the groundwork for the war in Iraq. I think it's kind of like in that context, but I do agree. It's I understand what they're doing there, but I do feel that it is kind of a harsh penalty for people who were born under certain circumstances that were completely out of their control and wouldn't necessarily mean that they're disloyal to Russia.
Right. And there's another piece of this that I don't want to skip over, that I want to take a second to talk about too. There's a line in there that says, should not have foreign citizenship, and this is the part, or residence permit in any other country. So the residence permit jumps out at me too, because what that means is that you can't have lived for any extended period of time in another country under a residence permit. So like a visa, for example, in any other country ever. So here's why that's interesting. On the face of it, it seems like kind of a bad idea in general, because let's say I'm a Russian and I, decide to go, to some university like Oxford University in the UK, or, some other prestigious university, because I want to, get a really good education. And I have every intent to come back to Russia and bring everything that I learned to Russia to make Russia better. I technically can't be a head of office anymore, because in order to live in another country and study in another country, I have to have a student visa, which is a residence permit. And so the first person that jumped out at me here, and I feel like that specific line might, maybe not, written specifically for this one person, but for people like this, is Alexei Navalny. For those of you who are not familiar, Alexei Navalny is what mainstream media would have you understand as Putin's main opposition leader, right? He's leading the opposition against Putin. And why this jumps out at me for Alexei Navalny is because Alexei Navalny spent a lot of time here in the United States. He went to Columbia University. And so by introducing this proposal, if it passes, which it, by all accounts, it like most of Russians have been polled on this and they're in favor of it. And, there's that whole part about his entire government stepped down. So I think passing this might be pretty easy for Russia, for Putin. But that would basically mean Alexei Navalny is no longer, not even a little bit of threat to him, because he's out based on that premise alone.
Yeah, but to Putin's defense right here, Alexei Navalny is really not that popular in Russia.
No, he's not.
He's not a very popular guy. And
2.3% in the latest polls, actually.
Yeah, 3.3% in the latest polls. He's kind of an obscure. Here's what happens in Russia. So the West, meaning, the U.S. and Britain and all the NATO countries, Europe, they find these Russian exiles or these Russian, maybe these well-spoken Russians who seem like they can work with, and they support them almost unconditionally, but they don't take in regard that they're not popular in their own country. It's like MEK in Iran.
Yeah.
Like the U.S. John Bolton has spoken at MEK conferences, and MEK was a terrorist group. MEK, they worked with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is who attacked the World Trade Center the first time. Mm-hmm. So it's like they're a terrorist group, MEK. They're a weird cult-like group. And in the U.S., the United States took them off the terror list because they are in opposition to the Iranian government. Now, the U.S. has the same thing in Russia and Ukraine. They partner with these kind of
rebels.
They partner with some pretty in the Middle East as well with the moderate jihadists that the U.S. funds. They find these really radical these guys who maybe they can present to the Western press, but in reality, a lot of them are nuts. And Alexei Navalny, Alexei Navalny, we were talking about this before the podcast. There's a lot of stuff that I'm no expert on Alexei Navalny. I've heard that he is a straight up bigot. I have heard that this guy is a lot more radical than Putin. And I pulled up this Justin Raimondo article that he wrote back in 2014, and it's called the coup in Kiev. And it's just giving context. It's about the Ukraine crisis and all of that. But he's talking about, he has a paragraph about Alexei Navalny and Eduard Livanov, two guys who were leading anti-Putin protest. And when you look at the guy that Alexei Navalny was accompanied with, and mind you, Alexei Navalny has had a lot of allegations about being a racist, saying some really bad things about people from southern Russia. Just a total, like a real Russian nationalist, but more of a real Russian ethno-nationalist. This guy, Edward Limonov, who he kept in his company, is the founder of the National Bolshevik Party. Now, type in the National Bolshevik Party in your Google search bar and go to the Wikipedia page and look at their flag.
Describe it to us, Henry. What does it look like?
So, all right, there's a circle in the middle. It's red, and then the circle is white, and then there's black crosses in it.
Like
it's a combination.
It's flag,
of the Soviet Union, like two of the most evil governments in the 20th century combined into one flag. So this is the type of guy who idolizes Hitler as well as Stalin. Like that, or
at least the ideology's there. Yeah.
And I looked up. I mean, that's what you're going for, right? Like, let's put the two worst governments ever in the 20th century together into one, like the two most murderous governments into one flag. And then I looked up that the flag was eventually the political party, the Bolshevik Party, was disbanded in 2010, but he founded a new party. It's called the Other Russia Party. And the Other Russia Party, their flag, and just looking at the aesthetics, same premise, but instead of the hammer and sickle in the middle, there's just a grenade. There's just a grenade.
Granata. That's funny.
It's so. I mean, a lot of these guys. Be suspicious of a lot of these people that you think are going to be in charge in Russia, or you think are legitimate opposition to Vladimir Putin, because this guy is not very popular. It's kind of an obscure following.
Yeah, this one caught me. Alexei Navalny, I understood that he didn't have a fucking chance, so I never really paid too much attention to this guy. I'd read whatever would come up on the mainstream media, and I fell into the damn mainstream media trap, because the way that they paint him is like this fucking liberal that is, trying to fight corruption, and he's like the only guy standing up to Putin. And I'm like, well, that's cool. It's good that Russia's got some people over there to, try and check Putin, whatever, and for the purpose of this show, I dug into him a bit more, and like you said, this guy is like an outed bigot. He says some pretty nasty shit about about people who are citizens of Russia, specifically those folks in the Southern Caucasus regions. He calls them, Russia has a 15% Muslim population, and he has, I'm not going to repeat any of the things that he says, but he has not very nice things, derogatory things to say about, the folks that live in those regions, which is very unfortunate. And the one thing that struck me as hilarious, this dude's an alt-right, gun nut, you know. His idea to solve the immigration issue is to literally give like ethnic Russians guns. That's how he wants to solve it.
Sounds like a real champion of democracy and liberalism, right?
Right. So, you know, I felt pretty stupid.
Shoot him.
I felt pretty stupid for ever like even having the thought that this Alexei Navalny guy was like cool, you know, or like
the other guy.
anyway.
The other guy is Gary Kasparov, and he's actually a pretty interesting guy. He's a Russian grand chess master.
Oh, really?
He's one of the best chess masters like ever. And he was born in Azerbaijan, and he's a big anti-Putin guy. I actually read his book years ago when it first came out. I got it signed. It was, you know, I have been involved in different conservative type groups over my life, and I've not saying that I still am involved, but I have been. And he was there signing books, and I got his book called Winter is Coming. And
brace yourself.
Winter is Coming, and it was basically just a big just anti-Putin book saying how NATO. It was basically if Richard Pearl wrote it, or if a neoconservative wrote it. Basically, how it was like the same type of propaganda that was used in Saddam Hussein. And this, as far as I know, this guy doesn't have any like scandals or like skeletons in the closet like how Alexei does. But he does. It was just a weird book. I remember reading it and I was like, this is really, really kind of. This is calling for people to basically invade Russia and start a war. This book, but this is a type of kind of weird dissidents that are in Russia, and like Putin is. I think Putin right now is I don't want to say less popular than he was, but he still has like more than a 50% approval rating.
He's got like 60% approval rating right now, which is crazy.
Approval rating. I think at one time he had like a 75% approval rating, but
I mean, but that's great for any president in almost any country.
All right, so this is where we went to the dual loyalty thing, right? All right, all right, here's what I want to go over. This one's important. So, the consolidation of the status and role of the state council at present. It is only an advisory body and is not prescribed in a constitution. So this is like the I gotcha. This is the I gotcha thing that everyone's claiming. And how
here's the 4D
Putin,
chess right here.
Yeah, the 4D chess is right here, written right here. It's how Putin's going to further consolidate power and stay in power forever. So basically, there is an advisory body. I believe so. It's not in the Duma or anything like that.
No, it's kind of like the Senate, but it's not like official, right? So if you think about the United States, right, how we organize ours, you know, we have a lower house, which is the House of Representatives, and we have an upper house, which is the Senate, right? And the state council is like an unofficial advisory board, and they don't have a ton of power, with the exception of having like, you know, political sway for the people that do. But also, you know, they're not like on the books. They're not like elected or anything like that. I believe they're just like appointed there by whoever's in power at the time.
Yeah. And essentially what they're doing is that they're making this part of the government. So where they'll have real power. I'm not sure what power they're going to have. However, this is where they're saying that Putin will probably go after he's done serving his term in 2024. Right. And what it kind of leads you to believe is that he'll have some type of post-presidential type title that will be given to him, like a father of the nation type position.
Right,
So recently, the longtime president of Kazakhstan, he resigned, but he holds the title leader of the nation. Nursultan Nazarbayev. He recently stepped down, and now he has the leader of the nation title. And he's kind of like seen as like this elder statesman who grants advice and things like that.
Right.
And this has actually been
same
done
thing with
throughout
Singapore too. Yeah, like you were just
same thing
say.
with Singapore as well.
It's Lee Kuan Yew. He was the first president or prime minister, I should say, of Singapore. And governed for like 30 years and then stepped down and became this like unofficial, official part of the government still.
Well, Nazarbayev, I think he was president since 1990. So, and he was kind of an animal too.
Yeah.
But so this has been an act or something that leaders have done throughout history. And it's interesting, just to bring it back to our last episode when we were talking about World War I origins. We were talking about the Serbian royal family and how kind of twisted that political system was.
Right.
I talked about King Alexander, who was eventually assassinated by Serbian nationalists in a military coup, the one that was brutally murdered and thrown out of the balcony.
Right.
Well, prior to him being murdered, his father had been running the country for about I forget the exact period, from basically the 1870s to like the 1890s or so. He had a pretty long run, but he had an affair. He had a pretty big, a sex scandal. He was kind of forced to resign, but what he did was that he put his son in charge at an early age. He was like 16 when he first assumed the king, and when he became when his son became king, they arrested a bunch of government officials. It was like some weird ceremony. It's like they had dinner and then they declared a toast, and then this King Alexander, he had them all arrested, like, you are all under arrest, like out of a movie type thing. Mm-hmm. King Ibrahimovic King Milos, he became the King Father Milos, and he still basically held the position of king and held executive powers within the country. So that's just an example in history of how that power is kind of played out. Does Putin do that? Does he have a role like that after he is removed, after he's no longer president of Russia? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I can definitely see him having that type of elder statesman like role where he advises and kind of has a position to maybe ceremonial to kind of veto different things that go on that he may agree on, or at least would be the threat of veto from Putin. And
right.
I'm sure that
kind
of
like becoming a Mitch McConnell, if you will.
Putin has had Russian politics are a little bit different than American politics.
Right.
Putin, in his rise to power, he had open alliances with mafia figures and crime bosses. So, I mean, maybe you can die if you disobey the elder statesman. And I'm just, that is kind of like the mainstream generic media, but I think there is actually some truth to that. Like that, he probably will do that.
I agree, and I think what makes it solidified in my head that, I mean, it's either the state council that he'll join or the security council. Either one of the two, I could see him totally doing, and I don't see him just like resigning and then just like going to live, in a fucking ranch and paint paintings like George W. Bush did, because I don't think it's safe for him to not be in the government. Like, he's made a lot of fucking enemies, like a lot. And like, yeah, he might be the most, like, the richest person in the world, by some accounts he probably is, even though his money's spread out quite a bit. But it's probably not safe for him not to have a constant, like, government, like, figurehead status where the whole country is always watching him and, like, gives a shit about him and things like that. I think it's not safe for him not to be in government.
Yeah, probably. I mean, his daughter is basically secret.
Yeah.
He has a daughter, and she's kind of held in secret because it's just too dangerous to be the daughter of Vladimir Putin. The guy probably has 20 times more enemies than Trump.
Yeah, easily.
The guy has, I mean, there's assassination attempts on him. But I think that probably would be the place. I can see that in the future after he's done. And, I mean, Putin has, at least geopolitically, kind of been, I mean, it's still hard to say because you never know what's going to happen in the future. But so far, he's kind of pulled some good moves for them. He's always playing 4D chess, so they
for
probably
the Russians. He's pulled. Good moves.
They probably want him around just because to get that leadership. But yeah, I think that's what he'll probably do. Because let's just say that if he was to, I think what the press was saying that they were going to that the way that Putin was going to maintain his power was that they were going to form a new union with Kazakhstan and Belarus, and they were going to form one nation and create a new constitution underneath those new solidified or unified governments. And then Putin was going to run again as the president of that with the Belarus and Kazakhstan and become the new president of that federation or whatever.
Bloc. Yeah.
And that was like what they were saying, but I mean, maybe he's tired. The defense secretary, the guy who always does the vetoing in the UN Security Councils,
Mr.
Mr. Niet, he wants to retire.
Yeah, he's tired. He's said so.
Yeah, he's been around forever.
Yeah,
he's been around since the Iraq War. I mean, a lot of these guys are probably getting tired after living these extreme lifestyles.
Yeah.
Jesus. All right, last one is the Federation Council, the upper house of Parliament, will be able to propose to the president to dismiss federal judges. In some cases, the Federation Council, on the proposal of the president, will have the right to remove judges of the Constitutional and Supreme Courts. So to me, this just sounds like an impeachment procedure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I'm not totally opposed to this. It sounds like a pretty good check on the judicial branch of Russian politics. But what's missing here is, like, where's the check on the executive? Where's the check on the, legislative, So, I don't know. I suppose those checks come in place because he's initiated term limits. But I guess it's a step in the right direction.
At the barrel of a gun.
I mean, my opinion on impeachments. I think it's totally fair to ask the questions and have that like judicial method of removing someone when they don't necessarily live up to the standards there.
So all in all, we left like two out, but these are the other ones are kind of boring. These were. So to me, this just seems that Putin is trying to close the door on. He's trying to close the loop. He's trying to close the loop. He's trying to, I guess, oversee who his successor is, and he's trying to make sure that no one else can have the same power that he did, and kind of eliminate the possibility of anyone following in his footsteps and doing the same thing that he did, like running for, being the head of state essentially for almost 20 years at this point. So I think he's trying to close that loop and try to and he wants to have a tight control over who comes in after him. I think that's kind of what these are for.
Right. And there's pros and cons to it. As we discussed, there's definitely a bunch of things in there that sounds super reasonable. So don't like totally swallow up the anti-Russian propaganda, from the mainstream media on this. Like, there's some really good stuff in there. There's also some questionable stuff in there where we're not certain where the motivations lie for those. But generally, I think this is an important thing to kind of follow, especially in the next couple of weeks, because, Russia is a legitimate superpower. They're nuclear capable. They, at least by many accounts here in the U.S., they're, one of our biggest, I don't want to say adversaries because we're not like hostile with them, but definitely competitors, and, yeah, it's interesting. But the one thing that we didn't really touch too hard on that we can spend another minute on, I think, is just the fact that he put all these proposals in place and then he asked his entire cabinet to resign so that he can get it done. And that is crazy. Would they stop him from doing this? And if there was a threat of them stopping him from doing this, would, what the hell's going on in the Russian cabinet? Is this like a giant ass coup? Is this Putin's coup against everyone else? Like, I don't know.
I think he was unhappy with some of the people in this cabinet.
For sure, I'm certain. But like all of them,
Maybe he just wants to start getting a new like rebuild mode, a rebuilding mode.
Yeah.
For 2024.
Hey, I mean, maybe we should try that. What do you think? Let's just fire everybody. Start over.
I would fire. I would love to fire everyone
and just start over. Yeah, I'm
just
down.
fire. Just have new. Just everyone in the House and the Senate. Just everyone's fired, and then we'll
President
have full
and all
elections.
of the Supreme Court.
We won't even vote anymore. Yeah. We'll have monkey knife fights. Well, you bet on a monkey to win a knife fight, and you become a congressman. But anything else to say on this? Because I want to talk a little bit about
background,
some context. Like, and this relates to a lot of the talks that we were having about some of the exiles and that were some of the Russian exiles that live in Britain and across the world. Because I don't think anyone really has this context of what the conditions that really helped Putin rise to power. And I think you have to look at the fall of the Soviet Union.
Now, wait, before you get started on that, I have one fun fact about Putin that I think is important for this context.
The Putin calendar?
Nope. It's the word Putin. In French, Putin, or Putain, as it's pronounced, means fuck.
Really?
Yeah. Vladimir fuck.
Vladimir fuck.
Sorry, that was my fun fact for the day.
Do you ever see the Putin calendar?
No, I didn't. Is it like him shirtless on like horses and shit and bears?
Just type in Putin calendar, and I just want to hear your reaction on this.
All right. Consider it typed.
So the Putin calendar is a calendar that showcases Vladimir Putin in different scenarios. Do you see it yet?
I'm just looking at some of the images. Holy shit. Okay, him with like a jaguar or whatever. Him riding a horse. That's where that horse picture comes from? I didn't know that.
It comes from the Putin calendar.
There's him with like a fucking machine gun or a Dragunov sniper rifle. Him in a sauna. A lot of these are him shirtless. Him fishing. This is funny.
The best one is he is in a he's in a plane, but like a plane with he's in a plane, and he's like a one person plane that's like super small, and he's leading a flock of geese. You ever see, what's that movie that came out in the 90s? Was it with Anna Paquin? Anna Paquin? Is that her name?
Yeah. Manny Pacquiao, Anna Paquin.
Anna Paquin, she was like, I forget what the name of this movie, but she was leading geese, I think from like Canada to Florida or something like that.
Yeah, and she was in that little like airplane thing, right?
That's what it is. He's in that plane, and he's leading geese. Mm-hmm. It's incredible.
Yeah.
I really, really need one of those calendars.
Mm-hmm. When's your birthday again?
In May.
Yeah.
I absolutely need one of those calendars. I don't care that he has blood in his hands. It's amazing. There's like one of them in a judo tournament. He was a judo champion.
Yeah, he has like black belts and shit, right?
Yeah. And then there's another one with him. I don't know. He's just doing he's in a gym in one. He's just doing a bunch of stuff. That guy that's interesting. But like, a lot of people lack a lot of context on Russia, especially like what were the conditions that led to somebody like Putin rising to power. And the period between the fall of the Soviet Union, so the period between when Ronald Reagan told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall,
Mr. Gorbachev,
tear down this wall, and what's his name, David Hasselhoff,
yeah.
Singing at a concert in East and West Germany, or it goes from that to the next day, Putin's in power. How did that happen?
Oh.
There's a whole tragic period before that between the Soviet Union.
He was in the Stasi
in
in East Germany at the time.
What's that?
The Stasi, the secret police in East Germany.
Who, Putin?
Yeah.
Yeah, he has a back. He was in a KGB. I mean, he's, which is comparable to CIA. So, I mean, he's definitely has a lot of blood in his hands as far as murdering and stuff like that. But most people aren't aware of the horrors that came after the Soviet Union, and it was really, really bad. Like it was bad after the Soviet Union imploded. I have a quote from David Slatter, who was a Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times of London. Between 1992 and 1994, the rise in the death rate in Russia was so dramatic that Western demographers did not believe the figures. The toll from murder, suicide, heart attacks, and accidents gave Russia the death rate of a country at war. Western and Russian demographers now agree that between 1992 and 2000, the number of surplus deaths in Russia, deaths that cannot be explained on the basis of previous trends, was between 5 and 6 million persons.
Whoa.
That is insane.
Yeah.
So the implosion of the Soviet Union led to one of the greatest humanitarian crises of all time. And we're talking about just mafia wars. Like the mafia wars in the early 90s in Russia, they're the greatest mafia wars of all time. And I don't mean great in a good way. I mean just in size. The mafia wars in the early 90s in Russia.
It's a Netflix special waiting to be written.
Yeah, it was really bad. There was mass starvation. You know, a lot of the sex slaves that are across Europe right now, or a lot of the sex slaves that were being transported out of Russia to, you know, the other places across the globe, like Saudi Arabia, were starving Russian girls who were trying to get out of that terrible, terrible situation, because it was a mess. And a lot of it has to do with the Soviet Union and the complete implosion of communism there. But also a lot of it has to do with the really terrible, corrupt leadership that was, Boris Yeltsin. I'm going to quote heavily from a writer from Forbes magazine who was murdered, named Paul Klepkinov. He said it was one of the most corrupt regimes in history, and this guy died after he wrote this article called the Godfather of the Kremlin, where he dives into like the total corruption of the Yeltsin era. This guy was murdered
right after the article.
He wrote a book as well. So he wrote this article, and then it was a longer book called The Godfather of the Kremlin, where he really dives into the Russian politics of the 90s. But he exposes a lot of the really bad oligarchs of this time. And Boris Yeltsin, the first thing that comes to my mind with Boris Yeltsin is that he was a drunk. He was a terrible, terrible drunk.
Yeah.
And he assumed power in 1991. And by all means, he inherited a really bad situation. So it wasn't an easy job that he had. But again, he's a drunk, so I'm sure he really didn't know what was going on.
Right.
And he embarked on these ambitious programs to really reorganize Russia's political and economic position. It was called shock therapy. And basically, it was he advocated a rapid transition from state planning to a market economy. Mm-hmm. And this transition was it was going to be a rapid transition, and it wasn't, he warned the Russian public, like, this is not going to be easy. It's going to be really, really bad. But by 1994, it's going to be all good. Everything's going to be solved. Russia's going to be a first-class market economy.
Right. Now, was it this transition that you're talking about, was that like, from communism to capitalism? Like, what's the context there?
So the context is that, the transition was not from communism to Adam Smith capitalism. All right. It was from communism to an incredible, egregious amount of cronyism that makes like the American system not look like a crony capital system at all. So a small conglomerate of business elites and crime bosses, they gained ownership of all the former Russian or Soviet Union state-run industries. And they were really unpopular within Russia, and what they were factions of communist insiders and well-connected businessmen who just took advantage of their positions and started buying up these key Russian industries and state properties at below market values. And it was just these really bad kangaroo auctions, and would be throwing up bids only a couple of $1,000s more than the other one. It was just these complete kangaroo auctions. It was totally corrupt. And it also limited other venture capitalists from coming in and investing in these Russian industries. And in a very short period of time, these guys they took control of the banking industry, the energy, and natural resources of the entire country. So all the former industries that were in the Soviet Union, all the state-run industries, these guys, these oligarchs, they came and they purchased them all, and they established complete monopolies on these industries. And Putin comes in, and Putin was part of the Yeltsin government. However, when he assumed power, he turned against these oligarchs. He put Mikhail Kordozhovsky in jail on charges of theft and fraud, and this guy was a total robber baron. I think his net worth now, I looked it up, is $15 billion.
Yeah, that's among the
so
richest people in the world.
How does this guy, this former commie, create a net worth of $15 billion? And this guy had a high position in the Young Communist League. His bank, he used government funds on a deposit, so taxes and state arm exports, as capital to acquire Yukos, a state-owned oil company. And his bid wasn't even the highest, but he somehow got away with it, and he was able to purchase the state-owned oil company at $350 million.
Whoa.
Can you imagine purchasing an oil company for $350 million?
Yeah, that's a fucking steal. That's a steal. And so the way that he bought it, just to be clear, you're saying the government put money into his bank as a deposit, and then he took that money, that deposit that they made, and used it to buy the oil company, right?
Yeah.
Whoa. And only $350 million.
Only $350 million. And these oligarchs were just going around and they were purchasing up all these assets in these fucked up systems, and they were getting government favoritism because they were former communist insiders or former insiders in the Communist Party. I was reading this article in LA Times about them. I highlighted this. Kordozhovsky excluded minority shareholders by moving shareholder meetings at the last minute to remote locations. He ordered the assurance of shares to dilute the power of other stockholders. After the financial collapse in 1998, he shoveled his remaining assets through subsidiaries to hide them from creditors. Once at a time, regulators were asking tough questions about operations by his bank. Minitep, a truck carrying Minitep documents happened to fall into the Moscow River.
It just happened to fall into the river?
Yeah, it just happened to fall into the river.
Oh, yeah, I'd really love to give you all these documents, but it fell in a river. Sorry.
And what Putin did is that Putin turned against all these guys, and he started putting these guys in jails. Kordozhovsky was jailed on charges of theft and fraud by Putin. And these other oligarchs that were doing the same type of stuff. So Roman Abramovich, worth $12.8 billion, was in the Yeltsin oligarch inner circle, and he was rewarded with a virtual monopoly on all aluminum production in the former Soviet Union.
Aluminium.
He was exiled by Putin. These guys were just getting favors from the government, and they were just purchasing all these assets, and it was just really, really bad. And the biggest one, the guy that is probably most famous that a lot of you may know, was Boris Berezovsky, and he was Putin's main enemy throughout the 2000s. He was another oligarch that was exiled. He was a car dealer,
used car salesman.
he was a used cars dealer, and the crimes of this guy are crazy. So I actually have an article. So I went through the article Godfather of the Kremlin, so not the book. And I recommend you guys reading this right now. And I want to quote some stuff from this because this guy died because of this article when he exposed Boris Berezovsky. I'll just read some of the quotes from this about this guy. Russia is a bubbling cauldron of criminal organizations, Sicily on a giant scale. Last year, some 40,000 people were murdered in Russia and 70,000 disappeared, probably never to be heard of again. The murder rate in Russia is 3 or 4 times higher than in New York City.
And that was at the time when New York City was pretty fucking bad.
Yeah, New York City was pretty bad in the early 90s, and this article was written, I believe, in 1994, so pretty early into the 90s. Assassination is a tool of business competition. Scores of business leaders and media personalities have been killed. Ivan Kivaletti, a banker and founder of the Russian Business Roundtable, was murdered last year by poison, an obscure nerve toxin applied to the rim of his coffee cup. Neither this nor any other Russia's most famous contract killings have been solved. In this violent world, Boris Berezovsky looms like a giant shadow. Berezovsky recently claimed that he and 6 other top businessmen control 50% of the Russian economy. He's certainly one of the country's first dollar billionaires. His base is Lagavas, Russia's largest car dealership, but this is only the most visible tip of the golden iceberg. In a recent interview with Forbes, Berezovsky said Russia is undergoing a redistribution of property on a scale of unprecedented in history. No one is satisfied, neither those who got nothing nor those who got something, since even they feel they did not get enough. Berezovsky is clearly one of those who never feels he has had enough.
That's nuts.
So, like, this guy was just... All right, so this guy was... I don't know if I should go through the full article because we're at an hour and 15 minutes, but... I want to post this out because I want people to read this because it provides a lot of context into the political situation in Russia in the early 90s. But I want to go into just a couple more things about this guy. So what is undeniable is that in addition to his auto dealership, Berezovsky controls Russia's biggest national TV network. His control was solidified shortly after the first chairman of the network was assassinated, gangland style. Berezovsky was immediately fingered by the police as a key suspect, but the murder remains unsolved 2 years later. Why did the police fail to follow up? Possibly because they were afraid of where the trail would lead if they looked too closely. In Russia, today's gangsters thumb their noses at police because they have protection from the very top. And the gangsters, in turn, are often necessary for the men at the top. Such is the Russian business environment today that men at the top often have used for shadowy army of killers and thugs who work further down in the scale of corruption, running prostitutes and protection rackets. The old KGB, a gangster outfit itself, used to call this side of things wet affairs. Every large business in Russia today has its own department of wet affairs. So it sounds like I'm not going to go any further into this article because it's just, I want people to go ahead. I want people to read the whole thing. But what it hits after this is that it goes over the murder case of the media company that Berezovsky purchased and over all the shady stuff. It goes over Berezovsky's connection with Chechen terrorists that he used as protection for his business. It goes over a lot of the corruption that was within his car dealership with different dealers and auto manufacturers, and it also just kind of laughs and scoffs at the idea that this guy was kind of characterized as like a good Western guy, and now he was friends with a lot of the neoconservatives like Richard Pearl, who were also profiteers of pretty bad things, because this guy Berezovsky, at appearance, he didn't really look like a thug. He had a PhD in mathematics. He was doing I think he was doing decision-making theory at the Russian Academy of Science, and he kind of came off as like this nervous kind of old guy, but in reality, he was a thug killer. And the context of this is why I'm bringing up these were the Russian oligarchs that really kind of just tore that country apart, even after it was torn apart already. Putin comes in, and even though he was part of that government himself, when he assumed power, he kind of turned on them. And yeah, there is a lot of blood on Putin's hands. The fact that, again, he's had open alliances with mafia types. But he kind of had to do that to consolidate enough power to get rid of these types of guys. And that's where I think a lot of his popularity is. And the oppression that Russia gets from Putin is minor compared to a type of oppression that Russians were going under the Soviet Union, as well as the post-Soviet Union collapse. So I think that's the context of why he is popular, and he's seen as a Russian nationalist. And again, Putin has his own wave of corruption and his own people that he has enriched with the government. So, and his own shady history with killing journalists, which I think some are true and some are not true. But I think it's important to get to get that story and to look at that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely big context because, obviously a lot of our media today is painting Putin as a very bad guy, and a lot of it is fair, right? Because he does kill a lot of people or exile them or silence them generally. But I think you're totally right. I mean, like, Russia was in a really fucked up place. And, the Russia coming out of that, they have a lot to thank of Putin for that, So it's some interesting context to, his move to really remove a lot of that power from him, because I feel like this is kind of like that final chapter in the Putin saga here. He came in, he booted out all these, oligarchs and cronies, or at least many of them, fucked a lot of shit up, got a bunch of blood on his hands, but in the end, it looks like he is stepping down, and he is, closing those loopholes so that shit like this didn't happen again, which is commendable in one way, but definitely still worth, a fair bit of skepticism.
Ryan Dawson he compared him to George H.W. Bush, George Bush's father,
right? As
in he was, George Bush was in the CIA, Putin was in the KGB, and they both did a lot of bad things. However, they were both nationalist, and I don't want to come off as like, I think a big problem with a lot of people in the alternative media space, or people who tend to question U.S. foreign policy decisions, is that what they'll do is that they'll create some sort of false dichotomy where you need to either be with the mainstream narrative or be with Putin.
Completely against it, right?
And, you can't live your life like that, because just because Russia may not have as aggressive as a foreign policy as the United States has had over the past 20 years, doesn't mean that they wouldn't be doing the same thing if they could. And I mean, they do a lot of fucked up stuff too. Right. You can't act like they're the good guys. They're just a country that does things in their own interest, and sometimes that is aligned with U.S. foreign policy. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it looks admirable on the surface, but look at Syria, for example. Yeah, it's good that Russia went to go fight ISIS. However, I mean, they're killing civilians.
Right.
It may not be as theatrical as how other mainstream outlets will portray it with gas, but in my mind, with gas attacks and stuff like that, I'm always thinking, like, what the fuck does it matter? Like, what does it matter if someone's killed in a civilian airstrike or if they're killed with gas? It's both. These people are dying regardless. And, like, they're killing a lot of civilians in Syria. So, that stuff is not good, and that stuff shouldn't be brushed off, and you don't act like it's happened, or, don't act like every single person they've killed is a terrorist, but it's... Just don't fall into these traps of, like, one side is good and the other side is evil, or vice versa. You have to condemn the behavior of countries, or the behavior of leaders, and not necessarily condemn the actual person, because when you're condemning the person, then automatically everything that they do is evil. You should be condemning their behavior, because if you're condemning their behavior, then you could, possibly set some sort of positive reinforcement structure in place, where if an entire country disagrees with Donald Trump on something, and I'm just using Donald Trump as an example, then there's probably going to be more of a chance where he'll change his mind.
Right.
Like, think about all the politicians who flip-flopped on gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
They flip-flopped on gay marriage not because of some moral compass. It's because the political polls show that Americans favored it more than 51%. As soon as that number went over 51%, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who had previously not been in favor of gay marriage, were in favor of gay marriage.
They evolved.
And I'm someone who thinks that the state should basically be out of marriage completely, and gay people should allow to get married. However, I don't think that gay people should be discriminated against in any way. And politicians weren't able to take that stance until the public supported it. So you should, and they were celebrated when they did start to support that. And good behavior should be encouraged, and bad behavior should be condemned, no matter if you have some type of grudge on that political leader or not.
Right.
I don't know. That's just my rant for that. Do you want to go into the musicals?
Great transition. Yeah, sure.
End of the light. Let's end on a lighter note.
Yeah.
So. Last episode we made a running joke about what I went to a musical, and I had the idea of writing a musical based off the Shaw and Richard Nixon's relationship, and it'd be a Broadway musical where they'd have duets together and all of that, and it'd be fun. And I encouraged people to email us at info@brohistory to give their musicals, to suggest their musicals. So we got some responses, and a lot of them are really funny. So I'm gonna read them out. So the first one, historical topic: Iran and Saudi Arabia's rivalry over the past decades. Musical title: Middle East Side Story.
I like that one based on the name.
That's
alone.
pretty clever.
Yeah, I'd go to see that.
Middle East Side Story of Iran and Saudi Arabia's rivalry. So how do you do that? You have like the Ayatollah, and you have like a breakdown of like the Ayatollah on one side and the king on the other side, just doing some type of competitive type of duet or something like that. I don't know what it's called in Broadway. And then you have like the Saudi type, like the Aladdin theme song. What's the song in Aladdin? Like
Arabian Nights. That one.
Yeah. Is there a Persian equivalent to that?
I don't know. A lot of the issues in Aladdin were, they don't hold up very well in today's 2020 woke society. A lot of it's pretty...
Really?
Yeah, a lot of those old Disney movies are pretty... they're towing the line on stereotypes there,
Well, just give me a break. It was a good movie.
It was a good movie. I
enjoyed it. I didn't think any lesser of Arabs after I watched it. I think it's funny now because I overheard someone talking about their daughter getting in trouble for dressing up as Pocahontas.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
And I was like, huh? Or not. It wasn't their daughter. I think it was her. She was worried that someone would see her picture of her dressed up as Pocahontas when she was really young, and that she would get in trouble for it.
Yeah.
Like when she was like a young child. And I was like, what? Like, you're seriously worried over that? Like, who's going to go after you for that?
You never know, man.
You dressed up as Pocahontas when you were 11 years old. You're fired, you racist bigot. Culture appropriation. Think about all the people who dressed up as Jasmine.
Yeah.
All the girls who dressed up as Jasmine when we were younger.
Yep.
My sister she was in a play as Jasmine. That's culture appropriation, right?
They couldn't find a nice like brown girl to play the part.
They could have, because we went to diverse schools.
Well, so then maybe then it was cultural appropriation, but it was the fault.
Maybe it was merit based, and they just totally surpassed. They totally disregarded any type of race or anything like that.
Maybe.
All right.
What's the next one? Yeah.
Fuck musicals. Do a breakdancing movie. You got Serve style on the IDF in Hamas.
I'd watch that too. That sounds awesome.
That's funny because there's a video. I think there was a short film. They're called short films, right?
Mm-hmm.
Short films on that had that premise of like
and IDF.
It wasn't a breakdance, but it was like an Israel-Palestine short film, and the two sides were like it was like a musical where they were dancing against each other.
I'm thinking of that Macklemore song "Dance Off." That's what I got stuck in my head right now. And just watching some like Hamas people and like some IDF soldiers on the border, and then they just like they got their guns pointed at each other, and then suddenly they just drop them. Some music drops, and then they're just like "Dance Off." Like
you got served.
And then like from Key and Peele, you remember that guy that the skit? It was like "Nice," like you just include that guy. Yeah, I'd watch that. That sounds entertaining.
Imagine Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the Knesset. They are 6 months away from giving us a serving. We had to serve them first for our security.
6 months away from developing the worm.
All right. This one's funny. An animated musical on Xi Jinping and his forest critter friends.
Oh my god. This is a Winnie the Pooh callback, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a Winnie
hilarious.
the Pooh callback. I think that would be very cute.
That's great.
For those of you who don't know, they outlawed Winnie the Pooh in China because
somebody made a meme about Xi Jinping looking like Winnie the Pooh, and he was butthurt about it, so they outlawed it.
It is kind of funny.
It is.
Do you watch him show New Girl?
No, I've heard things about it.
You wouldn't get this reference then. But he looks like the Asian guy in New Girl. Tram. Yeah. All right. This one's fucked up. 9/11 the musical.
Nope. Sorry.
I think we're gonna have to pass
Veto.
on that one.
Sorry, you're a fucked up individual. Don't no.
All right. So this one is all right. This is the last one. So, do a musical on the rise and fall of Saddam Hussein.
Okay.
I think that would be pretty interesting. It would be like Top Gun.
Yeah.
It would be like not Top Gun. What's it called? What's the movie with Charlie Sheen? Top Shooters. It was a parody on Top Gun and
Tropic
a parody
Thunder?
on Rambo. It was with Charlie Sheen and Hot Shots.
Hot Shots. That's the one.
So Hot Shots Part Duo is like a total parody on Rambo, and Charlie Sheen goes into like a POW camp in Iraq, and he's trying to rescue these soldiers, and Saddam Hussein is a character in it, and he's just a complete buffoon. Like, he's just a complete idiot. And I don't know why that made me think of it, but it was a funny movie.
Personally, I always liked the South Park rendition of Saddam Hussein. I always thought that was a funny character, so I could see this working.
The South Park.
Yeah.
Oh, well, he does sing songs in the South Park rendition.
Yes, he does. Many songs. Many songs.
So I think you already have one. All right. So there's also a question at the end of this too, which so did you see that CIA hack Mike Baker on Joe Rogan?
No.
He blamed the Soleimani on the Sunni insurgency.
Really?
Are you fucking kidding me?
Okay, so I don't know who Mike Baker is. Is he part of the CIA, or are they just saying he's a CIA hack?
So I didn't know who Mike Baker was either until people told me about the Joe Rogan podcast, and I haven't seen it, so I have zero clue what he said. But apparently, this guy who I guess he's a former CIA analyst or his former CIA guy. I don't know what his position is. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he was talking about Soleimani and why the justification for killing him. And I guess apparently I haven't seen it, so I don't know exactly what he said, but people have said that he was, I guess, justifying the killing, the assassination, and he was he did that by saying that he was involved in the Sunni insurgency. And if that's true, if he said that, then that's really, really dumb.
Right.
That's nuts. If you blame the Sunni insurgency on Iran, then you have zero understanding of the Middle East. Like, you don't know anything. If you can't distinguish that, like if you think that Iran sponsored any type of Sunni insurgency, then you're really dumb and you're clueless. You don't know anything. So don't talk about it. Don't talk about the Middle East if you don't know those basics. If you don't know that Iran is a Shiite country, and the Sunni insurgency, they're not Shiite, and they're enemies.
And they don't like each other.
Just don't talk about the Middle East if you don't know those like very, very rudimentary things about the Middle East and Middle Eastern politics and dynamics.
Right, and there's a ton There's a ton of shit that's like nuanced in the Middle East, right? So sometimes it doesn't always fall on that Sunni and Shiite line. But if it's true that this dude is straight up saying that Salami, as we call him, like he started it or pushed for it, like, or that they were in cahoots with one another, it's a bridge too far, for sure.
Dude, I see people on social media equating they're confusing Soleimani and Baghdadi together.
It's like the same guy.
they're confusing it, and I'm just
brown bad guy bad.
They're confusing the stories together because
right.
they're just so clueless. They're talking about, I saw this one moron on Facebook, and he was saying something like, the Washington Post called Soleimani a religious scholar, Frontline Head News. And like basically what he did is that he combined the story of Baghdadi, because the Washington Post had Baghdadi is the leader of ISIS, right, a Sunni radical group, not a Shiite group,
right? And
he combined those groups together. He combined those stories together, where it's just like, dude, if you don't know about something, there's no shame in that.
Just quit Twitter.
And like, listen, like I like Joe Rogan. I enjoy Joe Rogan's podcast. I don't necessarily enjoy the ones he does on politics, because he typically has like the same crowd, like the intellectual dark web types. But I like the ones he does on the UFC and the ones he does on like with weird scientists and stuff like that.
Yeah, I love the science ones. I always watch those. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's something that I enjoy, and it's something I would never want to stop listening to. And I mean, Joe Rogan doesn't know anything about the Middle East. Like, you can't blame him on that. When he has a guest like that who's saying stuff, and he probably doesn't know what questions to ask or know.
He has to take them on their word, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, he hasn't followed that side of the world. So I mean, you can't blame him. I don't believe in this guilt by association type thing.
Right.
Just because he has a guest you don't like, don't fucking disregard him. Like, he still is a good show.
It's arguably the biggest podcast now.
Yeah, he still is arguably the biggest podcast in the world.
Right.
But yeah, just if you don't know anything about a subject, then don't talk about it. Like, we don't talk about South America that much because we don't really know that much about South America.
Maybe we will at some point.
Maybe we will at some point. But like, I don't talk about like Venezuela because I don't really know that much about Venezuela. All right, you want to wrap this up? We're at an hour and 40.
Yep, sounds good.
All right, everyone, rate and review the podcast. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Bro History. We always do appreciate the support and your attention. And do us a favor, rate and review the podcast. Number one way to help us grow. And stay tuned for our next episode, which should be coming next Thursday. Peace.